before we begin, if you're listening tonight, let us know what time is it and where in the world are you tuning in from. Okay, and if these quiet histories help you rest, reflect, or simply breathe a little easier, consider subscribing. It helps us keep telling the stories that history left behind. Asterisk, it was the kind of envelope no one wanted to open, and yet it waited like a guest on the edge of a kitchen counter. It was thick, off-white, and bore the emblem of the United States government. There were no decorations, no handwritten notes, it's typed black ink. It arrived during a quiet moment in autumn 1968 in Peoria, Illinois, when the scent of green beans boiling over and meatloaf just beginning to crust still hung in the air. You could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock more clearly than usual that evening. The children had just washed their hands. The television was off. The weather was still. But that envelope placed beside the pepper shaker was a storm. This was how many mothers across America were first informed. Not with a call, not with a knock, but with a square of folded paper that made the earth seem to tilt beneath their feet. In Mrs. Evelyn Carter's home, the news was delivered on a pale orange telegram that simply read, "The Secretary of the Army has asked me to express his deep regret." It always began that way. The rest blurred. Evelyn didn't remember sitting down. Her youngest son, Danny, asked if she needed water. Kay, her eldest, Linda, stood frozen, holding the gravy boat. Her husband, Harold, was silent. The war in Vietnam had crept into American homes long before that telegram. It had crept in through the grainy footage on evening news, through the disappearance of teenage boys who used to mow lawns, and suddenly, war uniforms and framed photos on mantels, through rationed household goods, through whispered fears at church. But for Evelyn, like for thousands of others, the war became real the moment that envelope crossed the threshold. What followed was not fury, not protest, not even words. What followed was soup left on the stove until it boiled dry, a broken dish swept silently under the refrigerator, and a red apron folded and never worn again. Evelyn Carter wasn't a political woman. She didn't read the New York Times and rarely voted in midterms. She kept track of birthdays and potluck assignments. She had no interest in Saigon, Hanoi, or Ho Chi Minh. The war was not hers to understand till it stole her son. Her son, Specialist Robert Carter, age 20, had been in Vietnam for 4 months. He had written home about the humidity, the insects, and the canned peaches. He had asked for foot powder and photographs of the dog. His letters had arrived weekly. They stopped the day he stepped on a mine outside Khe Sanh. The months that followed were a strange blend of numb and normal. The casseroles kept coming. Neighbors knocked, bowed their heads, and retreated. The church held a service and mentioned his name between 2 hymns. But Evelyn felt as if her grief was a thing she had to manage, like laundry. Fold it, store it, take it out when appropriate. Never let it show stains in public. This is what grief looked like for many American mothers in the Vietnam War. It was not loud or televised. It was domestic. It was private. It was behind a curtain, beneath a dish towel, inside a half-finished scrapbook by the winter of 1969. Evelyn joined what would become known as the Silent Circular group of mothers who had lost sons in Vietnam, but refused to join activist groups. They met once a month in borrowed library rooms and sat without speaking for the first 10 minutes. They didn't burn flags or stage sit-ins. Teens, they just shared clipped articles, held each other's hands, and tried to answer the only question that mattered to them. Why did it happen? Outside their small circle, the world was growing louder. College campuses erupted with chants. Flags burned. Men refused the draft. Women chained themselves to gates. Presidents gave speeches. Journalists sent home grainy footage that played during dinner. But inside the homes of Evelyn and thousands of other women, the noise of the world seemed muffled. like it came through walls. These were women who had lived through World War II in Korea. They knew patriotism as something you wore quietly, like a brooch. They didn't know how to scream in the streets. They didn't know how to question the government. They only knew how to keep a house warm in winter and how to press a funeral suit for a son whose body was already cold by the time it landed in Ohio. For them, the war wasn't political. It was personal. It had faces. And those faces were gone. One by one, these women began to break their silence knot in marches. Put in letters to congressmen, letters to news anchors, letters to the Pentagon, letters that began with, "I am not an activist, but," and ended with, "Please, just tell me what happened." Evelyn wrote her first letter in February 1969. It was 2 paragraphs long and had no return address. She didn't expect a reply. She only needed to send it. It's like breathing out. It was only later that year when she received a plain envelope with a return address in Washington, D.C., and inside was not an answer, but an invitation. You were invited to attend a closed forum on familial losses and conflict. She didn't go. Not yet. Instead, she placed the invitation beside her son's last letter and reread the line he had written in pencil. "Tell Linda to eat her greens and tell Dad I still can't get used to the heat." In her house, the air was cold. Sun was gone, and the soup had long since boiled away. But that envelope sat by the bread box, unopened like so many others. It asked a question without asking. What does a mother do when the war enters her home and never leaves? Evelyn Carter waited a full month before touching the envelope again. It had begun to yellow at the edges, still unopened, still stiff. Its weight seemed to grow heavier every day, though it weighed no more than a few sheets of paper. That envelope was not just an invitation, it was a reminder, a prompt, silent knock. She wasn't the only one staring at paper that winter to cross the country. In towns, stitched together by telephone poles and flagpoles, thousands of women, just like Evelyn, were learning a new form of expression, writing into the void. It began quietly, almost accidentally. A mother in Des Moines wrote to her senator asking whether her son died instantly. A widow in Tallahassee asked why the medals came before the body. A grandmother in Sacramento, who'd raised her grandson after his parents passed, asked why the coffin was sealed shut. These weren't dramatic questions, They weren't calls for revolution. They were domestic questions, tired questions, questions asked by women who had long believed in following instructions, recipes, and rules. But now the rules had failed them. The letters started as grief, but grief has a way of asking deeper things. Where was he stationed? Became, why was he there at all? And eventually, who made that decision, and who will answer for it? Evelyn Carter, seated at the same kitchen table where Robert, once made model airplanes, began typing her second letter in March 1969. This time, she added a return address. She didn't expect what came back, a form letter. It thanked her for her concern. It referred to her sacrifice. It used words like ultimate duty and bravery in service. It did not say her son's name, and that omission hit harder than she expected. In response, she sent a third letter, this time not to the Pentagon, but to the Peoria Gazette, her local paper. It wasn't a letter to the editor. It was just a letter, a memory, list of the things Robert had liked: chocolate milk, Elvis Presley, Sundays. The editor printed it in full. 3 days later, another letter arrived. Not from Washington, but from a woman 2 neighborhoods over. A woman Evelyn had never met. Her son, too, had died in Vietnam. His name had been Marcus. He had liked fishing. He'd once wanted to build boats. Soon, these letters became a small feature in the local paper. Letters from mothers. Not opinion pieces, not essays, just unedited grief. Lists of favorite foods, nicknames, handwritten memories, scanned into newsprint. Some readers skipped over them. Others clipped them, folded them, and kept them in recipe boxes. And so began a quiet record-keeping of lives lost, compiled not by journalists or generals, but by the women who had wiped those boys' noses and folded their socks. Other papers caught on. Des Moines, Akron, Trenton, Tacoma, and beneath the surface of America's roaring headlines, bombings, riots, summits, there was now a parallel narrative, the domestic chronicle of a country, hemorrhaging its sons. But not all women wrote. Some gathered. In May 1969, a small group of mothers met in the basement of St. Jude's Church in Cincinnati. They called themselves Mothers for Quiet Truth. No microphones, no chants, just tea, silence. And sometimes, if they're feeling brave, questions. Questions like, do you still set a place for him at dinner? Or do you still get birthday cards from the army? Evelyn heard about them through a cousin. She went. That summer, she brought a bundt cake, as if it were a potluck. Asterisk, inside the church basement, she found 24 other women. Some wore black, others wore lipstick. Some had hair freshly done. Others hadn't touched a comb in days. Grief has no dress code. The women spoke slowly, if at all. They didn't ask each other what side they were on politically. They asked things like, did the uniform arrive with the body, or did you get to see him? These were the kinds of questions that no one asked on TV. The war on the television was full of experts and maps, body counts and bulletins. But in these rooms, it was full of casseroles, unfinished photo albums, and questions no general could answer. Slowly, Evelyn began keeping a notebook. Not a journal. She never liked journaling, just fragments, phrases, things overheard in those rooms. She still puts his boots by the back door. He was afraid of thunderstorms, but he didn't tell the army that. I dreamt he came home but had no face. That last one haunted her. And yet, even in the thick fog of morning, something else stirred in those rooms, kind of resolve. Some of the women, once shy homemakers, began showing up at city council meetings, not to protest, but to ask if returning veterans would get counseling. Others wrote to funeral homes asking if they could offer sliding scale services to families like theirs. And a few, quietly, reached out to local schools, asking if students could be taught how to write letters to soldiers who were still overseas, not to encourage the war, but to remind them someone at home was still remembering their names. It was not a movement. There were no logos, no t-shirts, but something was happening, and Evelyn could feel it. That fall, she opened the invitation that had waited since February, the one from the Department of Defense. It invited her to Washington for a private listening session for families who had lost loved ones. She didn't decide immediately. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table and removed the apron she'd once stopped wearing. Then she unfolded the letter and read it again. You are invited. But what did it mean to be invited to listen, to be heard, to be told? Maybe nothing. That night, she left the letter beside the flower canister. She lit a candle. Not for ceremony, but because the kitchen light had started flickering and she hadn't called the electrician. In that faint flicker, she reread one of Robert's letters. He had signed it, simply, Love, Bobby. Not Robert, Potter, just Bobby. The next morning, she packed a bag, but before she left, she clipped a newspaper letter from a woman in Tulsa who had lost 2 sons. The last line read, We're not marching in the streets, but we are marching somewhere. Evelyn Carter, mother of Bobby Carter, specialist. Asterisk Washington, in the fall of 1969, was a city dressed in seriousness. The leaves fell on sidewalks thick with bureaucracy, and buildings stood as cold stone witnesses to decades of decisions, good and bad. The Capitol was not a place that made space for silence. But when Evelyn Carter arrived, that was all she seemed to bring with her quiet. She did not wear black. She wore gray wool coat with a broken button at the cuff, and she carried a brown handbag filled with Kleenex, breath mints, and a telegram. She wasn't sure why she brought the telegram. Perhaps it had become something like a passport proof of entry into a country no one chose to visit, the country of grief, the country of mothers with a folded flag in their linen drawer. The hotel was beige, the conference center even more so. She found her way to the appointed room, where a Department of Defense sign hung crookedly beside the door. Inside, a handful of women and a few men sat at long tables covered with white cloth. There was no stage, no lectern, no cameras. There were just chairs. Evelyn sat near the back. A man in a dark suit began to speak. He welcomed them. He thanked them, said the word sacrifice 5 times in 2 minutes. She counted. Then another man spoke. This one in uniform. I read from notes, he said. They were reviewing new casualty reporting procedures. He said the Defense Department was aware of communication failures. He said, we are listening. But the room was not built for listening. The acoustics were bad. The heating vents wheezed. The chairs creaked when people shifted. The air smelled like government paper and old carpeting. Still, when the microphone was opened for family input, Evelyn stood, not because she had prepared anything. She hadn't even written notes. She stood because her knees were stiff, and if she didn't move now, she feared she wouldn't move at all. Her voice did not rise. She said her name. She said her son's name. She said he liked chocolate milk. There was a pause. Then she added, I just want to know who packed his body. Was it someone who knew him or someone who didn't? There was no answer. A man from the Army Casualty Office made a note. Evelyn sat back down. Another woman spoke. Then a man. Then another. Some cried. Others did not. A few asked if the war was ending soon. One asked what missing in action really meant. No one seemed to know. The hearing ended with coffee and an optional group tour of the Pentagon Memorial Hall. Evelyn declined. Instead, she went to the National Mall. She sat on a bench near the reflecting pool. The air was crisp. Teejins strutted. Near her shoes, a child in a blue jacket fed them bits of bread, while his mother stared at the water. She reached into her bag and unfolded Bobby's last letter. Not to read it, she had it memorized, but just to hold it, just to feel paper that he had touched, ink that he had pressed. Somewhere in the distance, a protest chant echoed faintly. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm was familiar. She had heard it on television. She had heard it in nightmares, and now it surrounded her, softly. Evelyn Carter was not a radical, but she was no longer just a mother who cooked Sunday dinner. Something in her had shifted. Not transformed, but settled, hardened, maybe, or clarified. She returned home and began writing again, not to senators, not to papers, but to other mothers. She wrote 5 letters that week, then 15 more. She included her phone number, her address. She created a small directory, Mothers of the Lost. It wasn't official. It had no funding, but it grew. By the end of 1970, she had received over 200 letters from women in 31 states. Some were typed, some were handwritten, some were just postcards with no return address. In one sentence, I miss him every day. She made a quilt, each square stitched with a name. She wasn't the only one. Across the country, quilts, scrapbooks, and letter archives began appearing, not at museums, but in living rooms, in fireproof boxes, in church halls. Women who had once taught their daughters to iron pillowcases were now documenting unofficial histories of absence, of folded flags, of unanswered telegrams. Years later, when the war ended and monuments were built, few of these mothers were invited to speak. The headlines spoke of strategy, of withdrawal, treaties, but in kitchens across America, the war was still being fought with measuring spoons, typewriters, said folded napkins saved from better days. Evelyn Carter never remarried after her husband passed in the mid-1980s. She remained in Peoria. A refrigerator bore photos of grandchildren, but near the sink, framed simply, was the telegram. It was faded now, and next to it, her son's last letter. Once, when a local historian interviewed her for an oral history of the war, she was asked, "Do you feel like you found closure?" She had smiled gently and said, "No, but I found other women, and they helped me carry it." Years later, the historian would say that Evelyn's voice was the calmest of all the interviews he'd recorded. Not emotionless, just steady in a war of noise. Evelyn had chosen quiet truth, and in doing so, she had rewritten what it meant to be a grieving mother in America. Not loud, not politicized, not erased, just still standing, still asking the same question she had whispered all those years ago at the kitchen table. What does a mother do when the war never really ends? Asterisk. The Johnson family kitchen was not unique, okay? That's what made it important. It had the same Formica countertops found in 1,000 other homes across Indiana. The same beige rotary phone with a long coiled cord. The same wire fruit basket filled mostly with onions. It smelled like cinnamon in winter and damp linoleum in summer. It was not extraordinary, but in one small drawer, beneath a stack of yellowing church cookbooks and a box of birthday candles with only 2 unbroken, was a cookie tin, and in that, tin beneath a sewing thimble to Polaroids, and a silver dollar, was a draft card, folded, faded, and hidden. It belonged to Thomas Johnson Jr., or Tommy, as he was still known to the women at St. Agnes Parish. It was never supposed to be there. Officially, draft cards were to be carried at all times by eligible men. They were issued by the Selective Service and expected to remain with the recipient. They were not designed to be folded into eighths and tucked beneath a spool of thread and the remains of a paperclip collection. But Tommy's mother, Marlene Johnson, had hidden it there herself. It had arrived in the mail on a Thursday afternoon in 1970, when the war had entered its most bitter and bewildering phase. Nixon was president. Cambodia had been bombed. Protesters were being arrested at Kent State, and Marlene had just pulled a meatloaf from the oven. Asterisk. She didn't open the envelope at first. She placed it face down on the counter. Then she washed her hands. She wiped down the table. She waited until Tommy came home from the hardware store where he worked part-time. She handed it to him silently, then left the room. What was said between them after that was never written down. But later that evening, Marlene opened the drawer, pulled out the cookie tin, and placed the draft card inside. This was not rebellion. This was resistance by delay. A mother's form of protest, not against the government, exactly, but against time. As long as the card remained unseen, unread, untouched, there was a chance Tommy wouldn't go. As long as it stayed hidden, the clock didn't start ticking. It was her way of suspending reality. That week, Marlene went about her routines with the weight of a nation's conflict tucked inside her kitchen drawer. She folded laundry. She made macaroni. She drove her elderly neighbor to the doctor. She did not tell her husband. She did not tell Tommy's younger sisters. She told no one, but her hands trembled when she cracked eggs. Tommy, for his part, did not ask for the card back. He did not mention it again. Whether out of fear or complicity, he seemed to adopt the silence like a second skin. Perhaps he too believed that what was out of sight could be kept out of fate. Yet, the world outside their kitchen did not stop. Posters for anti-war rallies appeared at the community college. One of Tommy's classmates left town after burning his card at a protest in Chicago. Another enlisted voluntarily, only to be wounded 6 weeks later in a place called Quonk, tried that no one could pronounce correctly in this fog of uncertainty. The Johnsons' house became a quiet fortress. There was no political talk at dinner, no Vietnam coverage on the TV during supper. The radio was tuned to the oldie station, and yet the war buzzed under everything like the hum of the refrigerator no one could ever fully silence. Marlene knew that what she was doing wasn't legal. Hiding a draft card could lead to fines, even prison. But it wasn't defiance that drove her, it was dread, primal need to protect, to preserve. Mothers had always found ways to protect their children from the world's larger violence through curfews, curative soups, whispered prayers. But never before had they faced such an invisible, impersonal enemy, one that came through the mail, one that bore the seal of their own country. Marlene prayed, but quietly. She wrote letters, but never mailed them. She ironed shirts, she hoped he'd never wear in uniform. She clipped recipes she had no appetite to try, and all the while, the card remained in the tin, growing softer with time. By early spring, a rumor spread that local draft board officers were conducting in-person visits, checking for dodgers, pressuring families. That week, Marlene bought a second cookie tin. It's identical in every way. She filled it with actual cookies, chocolate chip, cute meal, raisin. She left it out on the counter like bait. The real tin she placed inside a hollowed-out cake pan she hadn't used since Christmas 1962. When she told Tommy, he simply nodded. That was the moment it changed. For months, it had been a private act of delay. But now, it was collaboration, mother and son, quietly, refusing to move time forward. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't organized. But across the country, in homes just like theirs, similar small deferrals were unfolding. Some mothers encouraged their sons to flee to Canada. Others arranged for draft counseling. A few burned cards themselves safely in basements with water nearby. None of them saw themselves as radicals, but history has a way of overlooking quiet rebellion. We remember the marches, the chants, the camera flashes, but we forget the cookie tins in the drawers, the deliberate silences, the meals cooked over unease. For Marlene, it wasn't about stopping the war. It was about pausing time long enough to hope. But time does not pause. And in the end, someone always knocks. The question was not if, but when, and when they did. What would she say? Would she say she didn't know? Would she hand over the tin? Would she ask them if they had sons of their own? Or would she say nothing and simply open the drawer? Asterisk. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that smelled faintly of rain, but offered none. The sidewalks were dry. The clouds hung low but made no promise. It was late spring of 1970, and the country was preparing for another election season while pretending the war would solve itself. Marlene Johnson was folding laundry when the knock came. Not a pound, not a bang, just a modest tap. She hesitated. Her hands paused over a stack of pillowcases. She listened. No second knock, no voice. Only the faint creak of the screen door swinging forward and back, forward and back. She opened the front door. There stood a man not in uniform, but in slacks and a jacket too formal for the weather. His haircut was sharp, his face unreadable. Government issue. He introduced himself without much preamble. Selective Service Liaison, extracting routine verification. Visits in the area. Asked if Thomas Johnson Jr. lived here. Asked if he'd received his registration notice. Asked if he had made contact with the local board office. Marlene stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hand. She answered with short words. Yes, he lives here. Yes, he got the letter. No, he hasn't gone down to the board. She didn't lie. Not directly. The man thanked her and handed over a small, folded no-tan appointment card. Just have him call this number by Friday, he said. Then he left no mention of penalties, no threats. Just polite insistence, sharpened at the edges with something harder than authority-expectation. Marlene watched him go. Then she walked into the kitchen. She didn't go to the drawer. She sat, the clock on the wall, ticked loudly. Why did it always tick louder when fear crept in? She folded the towel in perfect thirds, then unfolded it, then folded it again. Tommy came home later that evening with grease on his hands and a book of matches in his pocket. He said nothing when he saw the card on the counter. He looked at it, looked at her, looked away. They had entered a new phase. Until now, their silence had been a kind of sanctuary. But now it was something else to stand off with fate. The next morning, Tommy made eggs. He left the yolks soft, just like his sister liked. He didn't speak much, neither did Marlene. But the tension was different now. It wasn't fear. It was decisions, low and heavy, like molasses poured in January. That evening, he told her, "I think I should go in." Marlene nodded, but her eyes did not. Her face stayed still. She said, "If you go, they'll start the clock." He looked at her. "It's already started, Mom." She said nothing. Key didn't press her. Instead, that night, she opened the cookie tin and removed the card. It was soft now, worn at the edges. Key handed it to him, folded. "Don't let them keep it," she said. "It belongs to us." Tommy smiled, barely. 2 days later, he walked into the board office alone. The room was stare of fluorescent lights, institutional carpet, 2 flags in the corners. One limp, one frayed. A woman in her 50s took his name, asked for his card, made him wait. Then a man in a blazer explained his obligations, his upcoming physical, his probable classification. Kay told him that college deferments were being reviewed, told him he might qualify for a lower lottery number, told him to check back next week. It all sounded unreal when he walked out. It was raining that night. He told his mother everything. She didn't cry. She didn't boil water for tea. She just sat and asked one question. "Did they call you?" "Number?" He said yes. 2S for now. But they said that could change. Then he added, "I think I want to be a conscientious objector." Marlene looked at him long. Not because she doubted him, but because she knew what that label meant in their town. It meant weakness, cowardice, the wrong kind of courage. Tommy had never gone to war. But the battle was already inside him, she told him about the second cookie tin, about the cake pan, about the decoy, about her fear. He said he knew. He'd heard her at night, moving things. He'd noticed the fake tin, and so, for the first time since the letter arrived, they laughed. Just briefly. Not because it was funny, but because they had both been pretending not to see what they saw. Tommy began his application as a conscientious objector. He listed his reasons, his upbringing, his beliefs. He cited his volunteer work at the local shelter. He quoted scripture not for drama, but for context. The board denied it. He appealed, denied again. His number was drawn in the next lottery cycle. It was low in June 1971. His induction date was set, but something else happened that month, something he didn't expect. The family received a letter from his cousin Dean, who was stationed near Da Nang. Dean had seen the worst of it, but what he wrote was not about guns or jungle. It was about a young medic who had saved his life. That medic was a conscientious objector. He had refused to carry a weapon. He wore a red cross instead of a rifle, and he had pulled Dean from a collapsed barracks after a mortar hit. Dean wrote, "I don't care what label the army gave him. K, that boy had more guts than any of us. K." Tommy showed the letter to the review board. It didn't change the outcome, but something did shift in him. He didn't try to dodge. He didn't flee. He trained as a medic. Marlene, though still afraid, began saving newspaper clippings, not just about the war, about nurses, about rescue missions, about the wounded. She still kept the cookie tin. It's empty now, but sacred, a relic of the moment when time almost stopped. And sometimes, it's in the quiet of evening, as the radio hummed and the country continued on in fits and starts. She'd open the drawer just to look at it, not for what it held, but for what It once delayed because inside that tent had once lived the belief that a mother could, even briefly, keep the world at bay, and maybe, just maybe she had. But what does it mean when protection becomes postponement? When defiance is not refusal, but delay? Love hides something so completely, even time forgets where to look. When Tommy came back from Vietnam, he did not speak in paragraphs. He came home in 1972. Not with a fanfare or ceremony, but with a duffel bag and a polite thank you from the driver of the Trailways bus. The war was still going, though everyone pretended otherwise. America was tired. The newspapers had moved on. The protests had gotten quieter, more scattered, more resigned. But in the Johnson household, everything had shifted. The furniture was in the same place. The kitchen clock still ticked a little too loudly. The rug still curled at one corner by the back door. But the room had changed. Or, rather, he had. He wasn't broken. He wasn't angry. He wasn't particularly changed in the ways Marlene had feared, but he was thinner around the edges, as if someone had taken sandpaper to his presence. He smiled less, but laughed more deeply when he did. He asked fewer questions, but noticed more. He didn't talk about the jungle, or the rain, or the nights, not even the patients, but he washed his hands 5 times a day and kept his boots clean, even though he had no uniform to wear. The draft card never came up again. Marlene didn't ask what he'd done with it. She didn't ask if he still had it, if he'd burned it, if he'd buried it. It didn't matter anymore. The object had outlived its usefulness. It had become an artifact of a battle they had already fatanned, somehow survived. What mattered now was the quiet, the slow evenings where Tommy sat with his younger sister on the back porch, drinking lemonade and saying nothing. The nights he helped Marlene make dinner without her asking. The mornings he got up early, not for drills, but to walk the dog. They didn't speak of politics. They didn't speak of loss, but the silence between them had changed tone from protective to respectful. One Sunday, he found the old cookie tin in the drawer again. She had put it back, not out of fear, but because it had always lived there. He opened it. Inside was a spool of thread, a grocery list from 1969, and a single newspaper clipping. No card. The clipping was a letter to the editor from another mother, published 2 years earlier. It read, "I didn't burn my son's draft card. Kai just misplaced it for a while, like a piece of silver I couldn't bear to polish. Kept it somewhere safe, not to defy the law, but to delay the inevitable. Sometimes the only resistance a mother can offer is time." He looked at Marlene. Just once. That week, Tommy started taking nursing classes at the community college. He didn't call himself a veteran. He didn't wear medals. But when asked, he said he had served as a medic. Sometimes, he added, "Not because I wanted to fight, but because I didn't want to run." Marlene didn't attend his graduation, not because she wasn't proud, but because she couldn't sit in a crowded room full of loud applause without crying. Instead, she waited at home and made his favorite meal, meatloaf and creamed corned, put the good napkins on the table. When he walked in that evening, the house smelled like 1968 again, like nothing had ever happened. But they both knew better. Years passed. Tommy moved out, married, had children. The cookie tin stayed in the drawer. It became the place where Marlene put other things, receipts, stamps, a broken pendant. Sometimes she'd open it, not to retrieve anything, but to remember. Not the war, not the fear, but the months when love meant waiting and hiding and watching the world move just a little slower because a mother refused to let it go any faster. She never called herself brave. She never told anyone what she had done, not even at church. Not even when other women whispered about sons lost, sons broken, sons changed. But every so often, She'd hear someone mention the word resistance, and she'd think of her kitchen drawer, dot of the clock ticking overhead, of the folded paper tucked to birthday candles and sewing needles, and she would wonder quietly, privately, how many wars were slowed down by mothers no one ever noticed. Asterisk, her name was Clarice Rowe, and she lived at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Des Moines, Iowa. Her son, Private First Class Anthony Rowe, had been declared missing in action. On October 11th, 1967, she received the telegram while stirring a pot of beef stew. It came in a standard military envelope. No fanfare, no clear answers. We regret to inform you that your son, PFC Rowe, has been reported as missing in action as of October 7th, 1967, during combat operations in Quang Ngai Province. That was all. No explanation of what missing meant. No body, no belongings, no photos, just a label. Clarice stood in the doorway for a full minute before walking back to the stove and turning off the flame. The stew was never finished. For weeks, neither was she. Being told your son is dead is a tragedy. Being told he's missing is a haunting, and so she did what so many women of her time were raised to do. She wrote a letter, not to the government. Not yet. She wrote it to her son. She told him the dog had run away again, that the neighbor's boy finally got his braces off, that the maple tree in the backyard had lost its leaves faster this year. She signed it with all my heart, Mom. She didn't know where to send it, so she addressed it to the last APO number she had. She kissed the envelope and placed it in the mailbox, knowing it wouldn't arrive. But it didn't matter, because she wasn't writing to be heard. She was writing to make him real again. That was the beginning. Every week after that, without fail, Clarice wrote another letter. Some were short, some were long. Some were just lists of groceries she'd bought and meals she'd made. Others carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. She never repeated herself. She never skipped a week. The mailman never asked questions. He just took them. And somewhere in Washington, someone filed the returned mail under known forwarding address. But Clarice didn't stop. By the end of 1968, she had written over 70 letters. That winter, she read in a local paper about another mother in Sioux Falls whose son had also gone missing. She tracked her down through a church directory and sent her a letter, not a condolence, but a question. Do you still write to him, even if there's nowhere to send it? 2 weeks later, she got a reply. Every Sunday, without fail. I mail it to his old post. The women began corresponding regularly. They sent each other copies of their letters, not to compare, not to comfort, but to keep their sons alive on paper. By spring of 1969, they were joined by a third mother from Ohio, then a fourth from Pennsylvania. They called themselves the Mothers of the Missing. It wasn't an organization. They had no office, no website, just envelopes, stamps, and grief folded neatly into paper. They shared tips on how to track military contacts, how to decode vague casualty reports, how to navigate the Kafkaesque channels of the Pentagon. But mostly, they shared hope. One mother believed her son had been taken prisoner. Another believed he was in hiding. Clarice wasn't sure. Some days, she imagined him alive in the jungle, trying to find his way out. Other days, she imagined him already gone, but waiting to be found. The letters were her only anchor, and they were not just words. They were her resistance. Her husband didn't understand. He grieved differently, silently, occasionally with whiskey. He once asked, "Why write if you'll never read it?" Clarice answered, "Because if I stop, it means I've given up." She didn't want to give up. She wanted to believe, not in miracles necessarily, but in possibility. She read every article she could find on Mia recovery efforts. She followed the reports out of Laos and Cambodia. She kept a map on the laundry room wall and pushed pins into places where rumors said prisoners had been seen. In 1970, she received an envelope marked Returned Addressee, Unknown. Inside was one of her own letters. It had been opened, then resealed. There was nothing else in it. No note, no signature, just opened. It was enough to make her write 2 more that week. Later that year, Clarice and the other mothers began archiving their letters. One woman had a shoebox full. Another had several binders. Clarice had switched to filing cabinets. She began photocopying each letter before she mailed it, just in case they were lost forever. And she wasn't alone. Across America, thousands of mothers of me and sons were doing the same. Some mailed letters, key, others kept diaries to their children. Some wrote poems. A few recorded audio tapes and sent them to radio programs in hopes that somehow, somewhere, their sons might hear their voices on shortwave. One woman in Michigan reportedly left her porch light on for 5 straight years. Another in New Jersey cooked her son's favorite meal every Wednesday and set a place at the table. The nation labeled their sons missing, but the mothers refused to do the same. They held the space through habit, ritual, and repetition. In 1971, Clarice spoke at a local VFW event. This was the first time she'd talked publicly. She stood at a wooden podium in a room of veterans and their families. She held one letter in her hand. She didn't read it. She simply said, "This is how I keep his name from disappearing." Then she folded the paper and stepped down. That night, 4 people came up to her quietly. Each said the same thing. "I thought I was the only one." She wasn't. She never had been. But she'd been among the few who refused to forget out loud. And in that act of remembering, again and again she made her son real to others, too. But what happens to the mothers when hope runs out of postage? What do you do when the letters never stop coming back? What if the only proof you have that your son ever existed is a drawer full of envelopes? By 1972, Clarice Rowe's letter drawer had become something else entirely. It was no longer a drawer, not really. It had spread to the small filing cabinet in the hall, then to a shelf in the guest room, then 2, 3 stacked cardboard boxes under her sewing table, each box labeled by year. Each folder was then labeled by month. Inside each were rows of neatly typed letters, single-spaced, always dated, always signed, "Love, Mom." It wasn't that she expected a reply anymore. Was that stopping felt like surrendering a dimension of reality. As long as she wrote, her son remained part of time, still linked to the rhythms of birthdays, snowfalls, holidays, and supermarket prices. He didn't vanish, just existed slightly out of reach. And Clarice wasn't alone anymore. What had begun as a letter exchange between 2 grieving mothers had grown into a quiet, almost subterranean network of correspondence. They called themselves by many names: the Mother's Chain, the Letter Circle, POW Mia pages. Some were religious, some weren't. Some leaned toward activism. Others stayed entirely apolitical, but they all wrote every week. Clarice received letters not only from other mothers, but from strangers, friends of missing soldiers, siblings, even retired servicemen. Some included newspaper clippings. Others simply said, "I don't know if he's alive, but I dreamt about him last night." Clarice saved every single one. She never once referred to her collection as a memorial. She called it the living folder, because memory, when written down and revisited, doesn't decay the same way it does in silence. In May of that year, she received a typed letter from a woman named Estelle, whose son had disappeared over Laos. It included 5 pages of typed timelines, possible sightings, and radio intercepts, but the letter ended in a soft, human voice. "Even if they never find his body, I need to believe someone is looking." That line stayed with Clarice, because deep down, she knew the same truth that haunted Estelle and haunted all of them. After enough years, missing becomes an excuse to forget. That summer, Clarice began assembling copies of the letters into what she called books. Each book was simply a binder, decorated with a plain cover. Inside were typed pages organized chronologically, each one with a small header at the top. Letter to Anthony Rowe. Month, day, year, K. Some letters were filled with memories, what he was like as a toddler, how he once tried to roller skate in the basement. Others documented the mundane. The church is replacing the pew cushions. I voted for green. I baked your favorite pie this week and gave half to the neighbor. They found a bone fragment in a field somewhere near Kwangai. I hope it's not yours, but if it is, I hope it was quick. The bluntness of grief over time becomes unashamed. There's no one left to impress, only truth left to protect. In October 1972, 5 years to the week since Anthony went missing, Clarice received an envelope postmarked from California. It was from a former POW, recently released, who had served in the same division. He had read about her letters in a local church bulletin forwarded by a cousin. His note was brief. I never met Anthony personally, but I believe I heard his name mentioned at the camp. I can't be sure. I'm sorry, I can't give more. Clarice. Read the sentence over and over. I believe I heard his name. It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't closure, but it was sound. A whisper across years. A single syllable that might mean he had been alive after. She copied the note, added it to her binder, and placed the original into a separate envelope marked name mentioned, not confirmed. It was around that time she started attending gatherings, not rallies, not protests, just rooms of chairs and mothers and paper. They met in borrowed libraries, back rooms of VFW halls, church basements. Sometimes only 6 women showed up, sometimes more than 50. They brought photo albums, timelines, tea, tissues, and letters. Always letters. They shared them like family recipes. They read them aloud, sometimes choking back tears, sometimes managing a laugh when a memory surfaced unexpectedly. One woman read a letter. It's written to her son about the time he glued his sister's shoes to the floor. Another shared the letter she'd written on what would have been his 30th birthday. Just a single line, repeated 5 times. You should be here. You should be here. Clarice was not the loudest. She did not speak often, but when she did, others listened, because she never spoke to fill the silence. She spoke to hold it open. One evening, as they sat in a dimly lit room with teacups cooling on saucers, a new woman asked, "Do you really think they're alive? After all these years?" The room was quiet. No one answered at first. Clarice looked at her and said, simply, "I think he was." And that's enough to keep writing. The woman cried. That night, Clarice walked home in the dark, her purse filled with folded papers and shared names, and she wondered, just briefly, if her son had ever known. How many people were remembering him at that very moment? But what is the weight of memory when it's never returned? What happens to the person we write to when the world stops listening? What happens to the writer when hope becomes ritual? It's asterisk. The last letter Clarice Rowe ever wrote to her son was dated May 12, 1975. It was short. It's just a single page. She had written it slowly, pressing her pen carefully, as if her handwriting could carry emotion across a void. She didn't write about the weather that day or about church. She didn't write about sales at the supermarket or the neighbors. Dog, she wrote. They say the war is over. They say it's finished, but I don't think wars end. I think they settle in people like sediment in a glass. I think they get heavier with time. If you're still somewhere, please know I never stopped writing, and I never stopped waiting. She signed it, folded it, and placed it in a clean envelope. But for the first time in 7 years, she didn't stamp it. Cheat, she didn't seal it. She left it open on the kitchen table beside her reading glasses and a cooling cup of tea. That was the day Saigon fell. That was the day she accepted not that her son had died sincerely, but that the world had moved on without him. And so, perhaps, it was time she did too. But grief, even when acknowledged, doesn't evaporate. It reshapes. Clarice didn't throw away the letters. She didn't box them up and bury them in the attic. Instead, she donated them. She gave them to the Iowa Historical Society, along with the correspondence she'd exchanged with other mothers. The notes from the meetings and the folders marked unreturned and name mentioned. It wasn't easy. She worried they would get lost in the shelves, that no one would read them, feared that her son's name would be filed under miscellaneous or unverified, but she gave them anyway. When asked why, she simply said, "Someone should know." We remembered. The archive accepted them gratefully. A small exhibit was even arranged. Letters to the missing. A single glass case, 3 shelves, 2 folding chairs nearby. It wasn't grand. It wasn't televised, but it was real. And for Clarice, that mattered. That fall, she received a letter from a graduate student who had read her collection. He wrote, "I never knew what the word missing really meant until I read your words. Thank you for showing me that silence is not the absence of love. Sometimes it's the loudest kind." She pinned that note to her kitchen corkboard. She didn't write a reply. Somewhere in Texas, another mother wrote her last letter. In Oregon, a woman who'd once recorded her voice on a cassette tape finally taped over it with Mozart. In Virginia, a woman who had never stopped baking her son's favorite cornbread each Thursday finally gave the recipe to her granddaughter, because they gave up hope, but because hope had become something else. Not the return of a soldier, but the survival of memory. Clarice lived quietly for many more years. She volunteered at a hospital. She hosted book clubs. She never remarried. She kept the guest room neat, just in case. Once, in the early 1990s, she was contacted by a documentary filmmaker researching the Vietnam War. He wanted to interview her about the letters. She agreed. During the interview, he asked, "Do you think he ever knew that you kept writing?" She looked out the window and said, "That's the only thing I do know." Somehow, somewhere, he knew. And then she smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not a broken one. But the kind that belongs to someone who has built a cathedral out of waiting. That year, the archive digitized her letters. They appeared in a footnote of a book, then in a college syllabus, then in a podcast, and slowly, in ways no one planned. Her words, his name began to return to the world, because writing, even unanswered, is a form of presence, and presence, even in absence, is how we keep the lost from vanishing completely. Asterisk, it began, as so many quiet revolutions do, at a church picnic. Summer 1969. Dayton, Ohio. Potato salads sweating in Tupperware. Children screaming near the tire swing. Folding. Table with lemonade and lumpy cupcakes. The usual things. And behind it all, a row of mothers Paulette, pressed, familiar wearing floral aprons as they served slices of sheet cake onto paper plates. No one looked twice, but if they had looked more closely, they would have seen that something was wrong with the aprons. The fabric was typical enough pastel cotton, faded from washings, but the embroidery, height. It wasn't flowers or fruit or baby animals. It was text, stitched text. Small, tidy, deliberate. The aprons bore names, stitched in quiet rows. Dozens of names in black thread. Corporal James L. Barker, Specialist Nancy Odell, PFC, Roger J. Eves, Mia, Quang, Tri-Province, KIA, unknown date. Laos, some names were underlined. Some bore a simple cross. One simply said, Son, 1949 to 1969. Asterisk. They weren't decoration. They weren't mistake. They were memorials. Each apron was a record, a protest, a silent textile obituary. The women wearing them weren't artists or radicals. They were housewives, Sunday school teachers, Atita, treasurers. They baked casseroles and clipped coupons. But they had begun to feel the walls of the war closing in not through ideology, but through invasion of the domestic. The draft took their sons. The news interrupted their soap operas. The telegrams landed on their welcome mats, so they took the only thing they had full command over, their needle and thread. The group was called Sewing Sisters for Peace, but they never said the name aloud. They met every other Thursday in the fellowship room of Grace Lutheran Church. They brought their embroidery hoops, spools of black thread, scraps of fabric, and the names. Names were submitted anonymously, at first dropped into a decorated cardboard box labeled Stitch List. There was no vetting, no politics. If a name was submitted, it was accepted by spring of 1970. There were more than 600 names in the box. Some women stitched their own sons. Others stitched the names of friends, cousins, neighbors, kids. One woman always embroidered the same name, a boy she tutored in 3rd grade, long before he enlisted. The aprons were plain. The goal was not art. The goal was presence. To wear loss on your body the same way others wore silence. Each name took about 40 minutes. More if it included a middle initial. More if your hands shook. They used black thread for the fallen, gray for the missing, white for those still deployed. Red only when a letter had confirmed hostile action. They had no slogans, can'ts, just fabric, needle, and time. And when they wore them to bake sales, to potlucks, to school board meetings, no one quite knew what to say. Some whispered, "Oh, how creative." Others looked away. A few men called it shameful, unpatriotic. One even called the stitching a quiet kind of treason. But still, they stitched. One woman said, "I'd rather stitch his name now than have to carve it in stone later." Another added, "Every name I finish buys me one more breath. I don't spend crying." By the summer of 1971, they had stitched over 2,000 names. The local paper finally ran a piece buried deep in the lifestyle section, next to a feature on summer jams. The headline read, "Apron Ladies Add Message to Stitch Work." It missed the point entirely, but still, the group grew. New chapters popped up in Columbus, Madison, Reno. They shared patterns, traded thread, some moved on to quilt stitched. Squares mailed across states, pieced together like a map of Morning Dot. And still, no speeches, no arrests, no headlines, just hands, just thread, just time and the slow, deliberate act of making memory visible. One woman stitched by candlelight each night after her children had gone to bed. Another carried her hoop in her purse and stitched on bus rides. A grandmother from Pennsylvania taught her 11-year-old granddaughter to cross-stitch names in block letters. The girl stitched her uncle's name and wore it on a tote bag to school. It wasn't radical, it wasn't loud, but it unsettled people in a way slogans never could, because there was no one to argue with. You couldn't call a mother with a needle an extremist. You couldn't shout down a stitched name. You couldn't protest a memorial that asked no permission to exist. But still, what did it mean? Was this art? Mourning? Resistance? Was it disrespectful to wear the dead on gingham? Or was it the only way left to say what couldn't be spoken? And what happens when the war ends but the stitching doesn't? What happens when memory becomes fabricant? Fabric begins to fray. Asterisk, by autumn of 1971. The Sewing Sisters for Peace had outgrown their aprons. Literally, some women had stitched so many names that they began adding extra cloth panels to the hems, letting the list cascade down like mourning banners. Others moved. 2 sashes worn over the shoulder, long ribbons of cotton embroidered with loops of names: white for the deployed, gray for the missing, black for the dead. One woman, a retired seamstress named Lillian Hobbs, ran out of clothing entirely. So she began stitching her names onto loose muslin squares by Thanksgiving. She had 60-3. At first, she kept them in a basket near her ironing board, but the squares multiplied. She couldn't stop. Each evening, after dinner, she ironed a fresh square, set it in her lap, and threaded her needle. Her husband would sit in the recliner nearby, reading the paper or staring at the muted television. Neither said much. The only sound was the clock ticking and the threads sliding through cloth. Lillian began sewing the squares together, not for display, but for sanity. By January 1972, it was a quilt, 8 feet long, nearly 5 feet wide. No color, no border, no decoration, just names, row after row after row. It had the weight of grief made tangible, and she unfolded it. The fabric rustled like dry leaves when she ran her fingers across the seams. It was like reading Braille built from sorrow. She kept it folded on her guest bed, but word spread. Other members of the group asked to see it. Then they asked to add to it. They mailed her squares in plain envelopes, each one carrying a name, a rank, sometimes a date, sometimes just Mia. She stitched them all. The quilt grew. She had to remove the headboard from the guest bed just to lay it flat. By the end of 1972, it held 241 names. It no longer looked like a quilt. It looked like a scroll, a ledger, a textile obituary. That spring, one of the younger women in the group, a college student named Frances, suggested they display the quilt publicly, not at a rally, not at a protest, but somewhere ordinary like a library, a grocery store, somewhere. The war had only ever existed in passing. At first, the older members resisted. The idea felt performative. Their stitching had always been private, tactile, quiet. To put it under fluorescent lights felt like a betrayal. But Lillian agreed. She said, "Let them see what a mother can build when she has no answers." The quilt was first displayed at the Dayton Public Library in April 1973. It was hung across 2 collapsible tables, protected by a plexiglass sheet. A small typed note read, "Every stitch is a name. Every name is someone loved. Please read slowly." There was no fanfare, no media, but people stopped. People read. Some cried. A teacher brought her 5th grade class. An elderly man stood for 20 minutes and didn't say a word. A young mother placed her hand over one square and whispered, "I think I knew him." After a week, the library asked to extend the display. Then another branch requested it. Then a community college. Then a church in Cleveland. And soon the quilt traveled. Not far, not fast, but faithfully. Each time it was carried in a plain brown suitcase and unpacked by women with pinched fingers and determined eyes. They smoothed its wrinkles like reverent caretakers. They replaced the sign when it faded. The sign never changed. "Please read slowly." And still, the aprons continued. Meetings continued. Some women had started embroidering letters into their fabric. A few stitched entire last words, remembered from telegrams or scribbled notes. "Tell Mama I'm okay. We're going in tomorrow. Don't forget to feed my dog." These weren't messages meant for history books. They were meant for dinner tables, living rooms, unsent birthdays. But now they lived on cotton, on gingham, on squares cut from old baby blankets or wedding linens or cloth napkins. And in this way, the domestic became archive. They were documenting something that no one else was recording. The grief that had no uniform, no rank, no official number. And yet, their work still confused people. A man at the grocery store once asked, "Are you sewing for or against the war?" Lillian just smiled and said, "I'm sewing for my son." That winter, she received a folded envelope with no return address. Inside was a square of denim, slightly frayed, with the name carefully written in pencil. Private, First Class Gerald R.M., 1948 to 1969. Laos. There was no note, no stitch guide, okay? No thread, just the name. Lillian stitched it the next morning, in black, and added it to the quilt. But how many more names could it hold? How many mothers could continue sewing before the fabric of the quilt of themselves began to give way? And what does it mean when history refuses to record these hands, this labor, these threads of quiet memory? Asterisk, when the Vietnam War officially ended in April of 1975, the newspapers ran it as a headline. Peace declared. Evacuation complete. Last helicopter out. For the rest of the world, it was a conclusion. For the women still stitching names, it was just quieter. There was no banner to signal their end. No parade. No moment when the last stitch was sewn and the needle put away. They had no armistice, no treaty, because, for them, the war had never been about geopolitics. It had been about grief maintenance, about making space for names that might otherwise be forgotten, about staying busy when their sons no longer called, when their neighbors whispered, when the casseroles stopped arriving. Asterisk, the war, for them, wasn't over. It had simply moved indoors, into memory, into silence, into careful boxes, placed gently in hall closets beneath spare linens. By 1976, the Sewing Sisters for Peace had dwindled. Many members had stopped meeting. Some had moved away. A few passed on. The group's original founder, Marjorie Ellis, who had stitched her nephew's name on 37 aprons, died of a stroke in April that year. Her funeral was small. The women wore their aprons, not black, not somber, just cotton. In memory. Lillian Hobbs still had the quilt. Asterisk. It had grown to nearly 12 feet in length. She no longer traveled with it. Her back wouldn't allow it. But every spring, she unfolded it in her living room for a single day. April 30th, the day the last American soldiers left Saigon. She never invited anyone. She would pour a cup of tea, set it on the floor beside her, sit on the couch, facing the open quilt. Sometimes she spoke aloud. Not prayers, exactly. Not letters. Just updates. Your sister's boy made it into college. Price of bread's gone up again. Saw someone wearing your old baseball team's hat. She never got a reply. But that wasn't the point. The act of speaking to the quilt was its own kind of vigil. One spring, her granddaughter asked if she could help lay it out. Lillian hesitated, but then she nodded, and together they unfolded the cloth, smoothing it with their palms. The girl Lee traced her fingers along the lines of names. She didn't ask questions. She just read. Slowly, Lillian whispered, "That's all we ever asked. Please read slowly." In 1980, Lillian donated the quilt to a local museum. It wasn't a prominent exhibit. It was displayed only once a year, in a back room with dim lighting and a single placard. The description was short. Quilt of Names, a stitchwork memorial by women of the Vietnam era. Donated by L. Hobbs and the Sewing Sisters for Peace, 1969 to 1977. Most visitors walked past it, but some didn't. One woman stood before it for nearly an hour. A man wiped his eyes, then walked away without a word. A high schooler asked if he could take a photo, but the staff didn't allow flash. That same year, Lillian passed quietly in her sleep. At her memorial service, her granddaughter brought one of the original aprons. The hem was stained from years of wear. The stitches had loosened, but the name was still legible, and when she read it aloud, no one spoke, because the name didn't need explanation. It only needed air across the country. The remaining aprons found their way into attics, donation boxes, estate sales. Most were folded neatly. Some were mistaken for ordinary kitchenware. A few ended up in thrift shops with handwritten tags that simply read, "Homemade." But here and there, one still appears. at a community rummage sale in Illinois, at an auction lot in rural Pennsylvania, the back of a church linen closet in Oregon, and if you look closely, the light catches just right to will still see the names, stitched not for art, not for politics, but for memory that refused to disappear, because sometimes resistance isn't loud. It isn't angry. Its thread passed through cotton again and again. Its names sewn by hands that once buttoned coats and packed lunches and signed permission slips. It's the domestic maid defiant. And in the end, perhaps it isn't about how many names were stitched. Perhaps it's about the fact that someone stitched them at all. Asterisk. The table was nothing special. It was oak, probably fake oak, and it had a scratch down the middle from a dropped serving spoon during Thanksgiving 1964. One of its legs was uneven. So, a folded beer coaster had been shoved under it years ago and never moved again. There was always a bowl of plastic fruit in the center, gathering dust. A banana that would never ripen. Grapes with a missing stem. It's an apple that had faded to a strange shade of orange. But the kitchen table in the vicar's household had become, over time, a kind of battleground. Not the loud kind. It's not the kind with screaming or broken plates. It was the kind of battleground where silence became a weapon, and eye contact was a form of resistance. Nancy Vickers sat at that table every morning, in her housecoat, drinking coffee that had cooled too fast. She had 4 sons, 1 already enlisted, 2 in high school, 1 too young. Her husband, Bill, was a veteran of Korea who read the newspaper with his lips pursed and never commented on the headlines, unless they had to do with lawn care or football. It was 1970, and the Vietnam War had crept into their kitchen, not through politics, but through tension. Every morning, the newspaper sat on the table, folded to page A2. Casualty numbers, list of operations, photos from places they could never pronounce. Nancy, read them all. Bill didn't say a word, but every now and then he circled a name with a red pen quietly. Just once. No explanation. They weren't people they knew. Just someone's son. And the boys noticed, especially Daniel, the second oldest. He was 17, lanky, and loud about things that mattered to him. Music, krills, and the unfairness of the draft system. He'd been talking about that Canadian option. Nancy didn't respond when he brought it up. She just stirred her coffee. But the kitchen table noticed, the fruit bowl noticed. The linoleum floor, yellowed in patches, held the tension like moisture. It came to a head one Thursday evening. Late March, Daniel came home from a student-organized teaching at the high school, slammed his books on the table, and said, "I'm not going." His father didn't look up. His mother did. She didn't ask, "Not going where?" Because she knew. Daniel pulled a folded flyer from his backpack and laid it down on the table between the salt and pepper shakers. It was a call for draft resistance. It listed dates, names of local activists, even instructions on how to apply for conscientious objector status, or, failing that, how to cross the border into Ontario. Bill stood, walked to the fridge, opened it, closed it again. Nancy picked up the flyer and read it slowly, as if she were reading a casserole recipe. She said, "They'll call you a coward." Daniel said, "They already do." Then silence. No one touched the flyer, but the table had absorbed something permanent from that night on. It became the place where decisions were made, but never named. Daniel stopped eating breakfast there. Bill read his paper in the living room. Nancy continued sitting at the table, alone each morning with her lukewarm coffee and plastic fruit, until one morning, when she did something new. She opened the telephone book and she started calling churches. She wasn't looking for prayer. She was looking for options. Catholic churches, Lutheran, Methodist, Unitarian. It didn't matter. She asked one question each time. "Do you have someone who helps boys avoid the draft?" Sometimes they hung up. Sometimes they told her it was unpatriotic. Sometimes Softly, they said yes. She was given the name of a pastor in Cincinnati, a man who knew the paperwork, who had helped young men apply for CO status, who never asked whether they were sincere, only whether they were prepared. She passed the number 2. Daniel in an envelope. He never asked how she got it, but the next morning, he sat at the table again, and that table stained, scratched, unremarkable, held something sacred that day, a truce, a quiet alliance. It didn't mean agreement, it didn't mean certainty, but it meant they would talk. And so the kitchen table became what it had always secretly been, a negotiation platform. It had witnessed math, homework, and birthday cakes. But now it bore witness to questions no parent wanted to ask. What if they come looking for you? What if you go and don't come back? What if you stay and get arrested? Nancy wrote a letter to her sister in Arizona, asking if Daniel could stay there for a few months, just until things settled, just until they decided. She didn't send the letter, but she left it on the table. Daniel found it. He never said a word. But that night, he washed the dishes without being asked, and the next morning, when he sat down to eat toast, he unfolded a paper napkin and wrote, "I'm applying for CO status. If they deny it, I'll go." He left it beside the fruit bowl. Nancy read it after he'd gone to school. She folded the napkin, placed it inside the pocket of her housecoat. Then she poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't feel like she was losing him. But what happens when the war moves from foreign jungles to domestic furniture? What happens when the battlefield is a laminated surface surrounded by people who love each other and still might break? And can a scratched old table really absorb that much fear without eventually giving way? Asterisk, it was a Sunday morning in late April when the argument finally broke. Daniel had received his first official response from the draft board. Classification, Aja, fit for service. He read it at the kitchen table, the same table where his mother had once served tomato soup with saltines, the same table where his father had read aloud the names of local boys who made honor roll, the same table where decisions were avoided till now. Nancy had just placed a dish of scrambled, scud eggs on the table when Daniel laid the letter down beside the napkin holder. His father, Bill, glanced at it once, then looked away. But Daniel didn't move it. He let it sit there deliberately. Nancy saw the AIA at the top of the page. She said, "They didn't even consider it." Daniel shook his head. No interview. No request for clarification. Just a line. Your objection is not sufficiently established as grounded in moral or religious principle. He laughed, but it was hollow. That's when Bill spoke, and it wasn't loud, but it was final. He said, "Then you go, you serve." That's what men do. Daniel stared at him. Asterisk, in the room stiffened. The toast cooled. The radio buzzed low in the background, still set to the AM station that played polkas after sunrise. Daniel said, "You fought your war. Let me fight mine." Bill pushed back his chair. Nancy stepped between them, not physically, but emotionally. She placed her hand on the table, just beside the salt shaker. That's when it slipped. Asterisk. A small glass shaker, filled to the top, knocked over by her sleeve, spilled across the table with a gentle shee. A sound so soft, it might have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here, it felt like thunder. 3 people stared at the grains of salt spreading slowly toward the draft letter. It was Bill who moved first. He reached for a napkin and began scooping the salt into his palm. Nancy joined him. Daniel did not. He watched, and then he said, "I'm not running, but I won't kill for a government that won't even read what I wrote." It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. Bill dropped the salt into the sink, shook his hands off, and sat down heavily. Nancy, still standing, asked softly, "What happens now?" Daniel replied, "I go to the hearing. I explain again, or probably deny it again. Maybe they draft me. Maybe I serve, but I won't carry a weapon. I'll carry gauze and morphine if they let me. Carry stretchers. That night, the table didn't see dinner, but it saw Nancy writing a letter, not to the board, not to a relative, to a local chaplain, asking for character support for her son's CO. Peel. She didn't ask for approval. She asked for honesty. She wrote, "He is not afraid to die, but he is afraid to become someone who doesn't recognize his own hands." Days passed, and then something rare happened. Bill left a note on the table, written in pencil. On the back of an old gas bill, it read, "They made us carry rifles. I used mine to dig latrines. I never fired it. That doesn't make me less of a man. Do what you need to do." Dad. Daniel never mentioned the note aloud. He just folded it once and tucked it into his wallet. Weeks later, during his appeal, he carried it with him. He never showed it to the board, but he told them this: "I grew up at a kitchen table where silence meant love, where resistance was measured in salt and coffee. I'm asking you to let me serve my country in a way that lets me come back to that table without shame." He didn't cry, but one of the board members looked down for a long time afterward. His classification was not changed. But when his induction orders came, they allowed him to serve as a non-combatant medic. It wasn't a victory. But it wasn't a loss. It was a compromise shaped by wood, grain, and ritual, and the dull scrape of silverware on ceramic plates. Years later, when Daniel returned, he walked into the house with a tan duffel bag and new lines around his eyes. Nancy met him at the door. Bill stood behind her, holding a coffee cup, and in the kitchen, the table waited. It still had the scratch down the middle, the coaster still propped up one leg, and the plastic fruit bowl still sat in the center, now dusted once a week. Even though no one touched the fruit, Daniel placed a folded napkin on the table and said, "I kept a note." Bill nodded. Nancy said nothing, but she sat down, poured 3 cups of coffee, and reached for the sugar. The war had changed many things, but not the table. It remained the one place where they fought without breaking, where they disagreed without dissolving, where they left things unsaid, but never unloved. But what happens when the places that hold our hardest moments are also the ones that keep us whole? Can furniture carry history? Can wood remember? And is it possible that some wars don't end at a ceasefire but at breakfast? Asterisk, the bracelet came in the mail. It was thin, aluminum, cool to the touch, curved just slightly to suggest the shape of a wrist, but unbent. It had no packaging beyond a manila envelope and a folded paper with a few short instructions. Bend carefully. Wear daily. Remember, the engraving read, L.T. Call, William P. Colby Mia, the 12th of March, 69. Eleanor Hayes had ordered it 2 weeks earlier, from a small ad in the back of 17 magazine. She wasn't a political person. She was 17 herself, senior in suburban Milwaukee, who wore pastel sweaters and wrote long letters in the margins of her algebra notes. She'd sent in $2, not as a statement, but as a gesture, because a girl in her English class had one, because the ad said, "Keep the memory of our missing alive," because she thought wearing it might mean she cared about something outside her small world of lockers, dances, and pop quizzes. She didn't expect what came next, because the bracelet did something strange. The moment she put it on, it made someone else's pain real, not personal, exactly, but present. Eleanor didn't know L.T. Call, Colby. She didn't know where he was stationed or what he looked like, but his name on her wrist became a kind of haunting. A gentle one, quiet, but constant. Every time she reached for a doorknob, he was there. Every time she turned a page, he was there. Every time she raised her hand in class or pushed her hair back, he was there. This name that wasn't hers, bound to her by a curve of aluminum, and she wasn't alone. By 1970, more than 4 million Americans, most of them teenagers and young adults, had ordered Pal Mia bracelets from a tiny student-run group called Voices in Vital America Viva, based out of Los Angeles. It had started small, college kids, a fundraising idea, a way to raise awareness about the rising number of prisoners of war and those missing. In action, they ordered 1,200 aluminum bracelets, engraved them with names from Department of Defense records, and mailed them to anyone who sent in a small donation. They didn't expect it to explode, but it did, because something about wearing a name without a face, without a backstory, created a strange, profound bond. It wasn't a protest, and it wasn't necessarily patriotic. It was presence, worn on the wrist. Some wore them for fashion, some for family. Others wore them without knowing exactly why. And in kitchens across the country, on wrist, stirring soup, folding laundry, grading papers, writing checks, names of the lost reappeared. It became common to see a bracelet peek out from a cuff or glint under fluorescent grocery store lights. They were conversation starters, memory anchors, tiny, wearable tombstones, without graves. Some people wore theirs until they broke. Others kept them polished. A few painted them. Many promised not to remove them until the man or woman engraved upon it came home. But few did. Lt. Col. Colby never did. And Eleanor, still 17, didn't know what to do with that. At first, she wore the bracelet proudly. She told people who asked, "He's missing. I'm remembering him." But months passed, and the question stopped. No one asked anymore, but she kept wearing it because it had become part of her physically. Yes, but emotionally, too. It was a contract she hadn't realized she was signing. She began writing to the Colby family. She had found a mailing address in a newsletter for bracelet wearers. The letter was short and nervous. "Dear Colby family, I'll wear your son's name on my wrist. I think of him often. I hope this is okay." She didn't expect a reply, but 3 weeks later, one came, handwritten, from Colby's mother. "We're grateful someone is still saying his name. He was kind. He loved birds. Thank you." Eleanor wept when she read it, not because she knew him, but because she could have. That was the strange thing about the bracelets. They didn't sanctify or generalize. They personalized. They made you wonder what the engraved name had once loved, hated, eaten, dreamed of. Some people looked up newspaper clippings. Others visited war memorials. Few wrote to the Department of Defense for updates. And suddenly, a generation of teenagers became historians of strangers. Mothers, too, wore the bracelets. Nancy Vickers, from the kitchen table story, wore one with her neighbor's son's name. She polished it every Sunday. She never spoke of it. But once, her son asked, "What happens if he comes home?" She said, "Then I'll give it to him." But he never did, and so she kept wearing it. Long after the war ended, long after the house grew quiet, long after her hair had turned white and her wrist had begun to thin, in her jewelry box were pearls, a wedding ring, a gold brooch, but she wore aluminum because it meant something that nothing else did. It meant continuity. But what happens when you've worn someone else's name longer than you've known your own story? What happens when a piece of metal becomes a thread tying strangers together across time, pain, and memory? And what do you do with a bracelet that never gets returned? Asterisk by the fall of 1971. Eleanor Hayes had worn her bracelet for more than a year. It had grown warm to the touch, shaped now not by the factory's curve, but by the subtle topography of her own wrist, a tome, the name etched into Eto Te Kal William. P. Colby had begun to fade, just slightly, the grooves smoothed by sweaters in sink water and sunlight. She had never met him. She didn't even know what he looked like until she found a grainy photo clipped from a newspaper in a college library. It showed a group of airmen standing beside a helicopter. Caption was vague, but the name was there. and that was enough. Eleanor placed the clipping in her wallet, opposite a photo of her younger brother, who had just turned 16 and was beginning to talk nervously about the draft. She didn't tell him, but she started to wear the bracelet tighter. Asterisk around the country, the POWMEA bracelet movement had taken on a strange dual identity. To some, was a symbol of remembrance, civilians' pledge to never let a name be forgotten. To others, it had become a quiet indictment, a reminder that the war was still costing lives long after the government promised resolution. For military families, the bracelets were often lifelines. Asterisk. They wrote to the young people who wore their sons' names. They sent photos, stories. Some even hosted them if they lived nearby. A girl in Illinois wore a bracelet for a Marine missing in Laos and ended up becoming a pen pal with his widow for 10 years. One mother said, "I know my son might not come back, but someone, somewhere, still says his name when they wake up." Okay? Others didn't feel that comfort. Okay. Some refused the gesture altogether. Okay. Writing back to Viva or to the bracelet wearers, "We don't want strangers memorializing our grief. Let us forget." But most didn't write back at all. And so, for many wearers, okay, the bracelet became a relationship without resolution, a friendship without meaning. Loss, they couldn't mourn properly because they never truly owned it. Eleanor kept writing, not regularly, but once or twice a year she'd send a short letter to the Colby family. She never knew if he was still missing. The military reports were vague. Mere designations often blurred into presumed dead, but few families ever received a body. Still, she wore it, even to college, where classmates had mixed feelings about the bracelets. Some said they were performative, others wore their own. Eleanor didn't debate it. She just rolled up her sleeve, went to class, and continued remembering a man she would never meet in 1973. After the Paris Peace Accords were signed and the first prisoners were returned, bracelet wearers across the country watched television with hope they didn't know they had. Faces appeared on grainy screens. Names were read aloud. Soldiers stepped off planes into the arms of families who had prepared for funerals, not reunions. Some bracelet wearers wept. Some shouted. Some wrote immediate letters to the Department of Defense asking, "Was my man one of them?" Most were not. Eleanor waited 4 days. Nothing. No updates. No status change. Just silence. And so, she kept wearing it. By then, the bracelet had been on her wrist longer than most watches she'd owned. It had outlasted friendships. It had accompanied her on college exams, job interviews, first dates, funerals, birthdays. It had become a second pulse. At a campus vigil in 1975, Eleanor read a poem aloud. She didn't usually speak publicly, but someone asked her to, so she stood beside a circle of candles and said, "I wear a name I didn't choose, but I kept it. I kept it because it felt like someone should. I kept it because forgetting was too easy. Okay. I kept it because grief, when shared, is lighter. I kept it because he might never come back. And even so, I needed him to know he never left." The crowd was quiet after no applause. Its breath, and then someone else stood up and read another name. That summer, Eleanor received one final letter from the Colby family. Typed this time, "You're writing to inform you that our son, William, has now been officially reclassified, presumed dead. No body recovered. We thank you for your years of kindness. If you wish to return the bracelet, you may, but only if it feels right to you." She didn't return it. Instead, she placed it in a small box lined with velvet, along with a newspaper clipping, 2 letters, and the worn bracelet itself. She kept the box in her desk drawer, and every year on March 12th, the date engraved in 2. The metal sheet opened it, not for ceremony, just for memory, and she read the name aloud. Once.lt. Call William P. Colby, no rank, no status, no closure, but presence. And that was enough. But what do we do with the names we carry when history no longer mentions them? When the war is over, but the remembering isn't. When the wrist grows bare, but the absence remains. Asterisk, by the 1980s, the aluminum bracelet movement had faded. The ads were gone from magazines. VIVA had quietly ceased operations. The war had been replaced in headlines by other crises: economic recession, diplomatic summits, newer conflicts. The names of the missing were no longer spoken on nightly news programs, but in dresser drawers, attic trunks, and jewelry boxes across America. The bracelets remained. Eleanor Hayes now. Eleanor Trask, a teacher, a mother, a woman who no longer tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous, still had the box. She hadn't opened it in years. She thought about it sometimes when she graded papers at her desk. Oh, when she saw a student with a metal bracelet and wondered, do they know why? People used to wear these. She never brought it up in class, not because she didn't care, but because some memories are made heavier by explanation. One spring afternoon in 1987, her daughter, age 9, came into her study holding the bracelet. "Mom, what's this?" Eleanor hadn't realized the drawer had been left slightly open. She looked at the bracelet, still slightly curved, the engraving soft. "Now, with time," she said. "That's a name I carried." Her daughter asked, "Did you know him?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, but I remembered him every day." The girl paused. "Why?" Eleanor thought for a moment, then said, "Because his story wasn't finished." Kay, and her daughter, without judgment, without further question, nodded and handed the bracelet back. That night, Eleanor opened the box again for the first time. In a decade, she laid out its contents on her desk like old photographs from a former life. The bracelet, the news clipping, the letters, a few folded notes from classmates who had also worn bracelets back then. One simply said, "Mine came home. I mailed it back. Hope yours does too." She stared at the name for a long time. LT call. William P. Colby. Mia, the 12th of March, 69. She searched online and Act Impossible when she first received the bracelet. There were archives now. Scanned documents, declassified reports, memorial registries. She found a page. Status: presumed Kia. Body not recovered. Memorialized, panel 29, W line 64, Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Washington, D.C. She closed her laptop slowly. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She picked up the bracelet, slipped it back onto her wrist. It fit still. The skin was older, softer, but it knew the curve. She wore it for a week. No one asked about it until a grocery clerk glanced at her wrist and said, "Oh wow, you still have one of those?" Eleanor nodded. "Okay," he said. "Cool. My mom had one. I think she wore it through the 80s. "Okay." Then he rang up the cereal. Eleanor smiled politely, but something inside her ached because the bracelet wasn't cool. It was unresolved. And that's what so many people didn't understand. These were not accessories. They were ongoing conversations with the silence left behind. The aluminum was invaluable, but the act of wearing it was, because it made grief visible in a country that had moved on. In 1991, Eleanor finally visited Washington, D.C. She stood before the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, walking slowly along the wall until she found it. Colby, William P., panel 29W, line 64. She reached out and touched the letters. The wall was cold. She didn't cry. She simply unfastened the bracelet, placed it in her palm, and whispered, "I said I'd remember. I did." Then she returned it to her wrist. She hadn't brought it to leave behind. She had brought it to remind herself that even memory needs maintenance. Today, some bracelets still remain on wrists. Not many, but a few, polished, smooth, worn like relics. not just of war but of responsibility, and in private drawers, in quiet houses, in boxes, tucked between tax returns and expired coupons, are names still waiting, not waiting to be returned, but to be remembered, because the name on the bracelet was never really about the man alone. It was about the act of saying, I see you. I won't forget, even if the world does, even if no one comes home, even if the bracelet outlives us both. Asterisk, the guards didn't look at her anymore. She'd become part of the background, like the marble pillars or the sound of buses hissing at the curb. Her name was Margaret K. Rollins, born 1921, mother of two, widow of one. And for nearly 7 years, she sat in the same spot every Monday through Friday, just to the left of the Pentagon's river entrance, on a battered folding chair with a small cardboard sign resting on her knees. The sign read, Where is my son? That was all. No slogans, no demands, no party affiliation. Just those 5 words written in faded black marker on a rectangle of old shipping box. It began in 1968, 3 weeks after her son, Sergeant Dennis Rollins, had been listed as missing in action in T. Neen province. The telegram had come at 4:15 p.m. on a Thursday. Margaret remembered the time because the tea kettle had just begun to whistle. She had turned off the burner, but never poured the water. Instead, she folded the telegram 3 times, set it beside the stove, and went to sit on the edge of her bed. She stayed there until morning, and then she started planning. At first, she wrote letters to the Army, to her congressman, to her son's commanding officer, to the Department of Defense. None of them told her where he was. They told her what they knew, but that wasn't the same. So she got on a bus. She arrived at the Pentagon in a borrowed dress suit, her hair in a bun, and her son's name printed on a piece of paper she'd laminated the night before. She asked at the security desk to speak to whoever handles the lost boys. The guard blinked at her politely, then told her to submit a written request. She submitted 10. When the 10th went unanswered, she came back with a chair. She unfolded it at the edge of the steps, sat down, and held her sign. Asterisk. Where's my son? She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She simply sat, and for the first few days, people tried to move her security guards politely. Then, not so politely. Then again, gently, when it was clear she would not resist. She'd get up, walk 2 steps to the side, and sit again. By the end of the first month, they stopped trying. She never blocked entrances. She didn't solicit attention. She didn't disrupt. She just refused to leave. Every weekday morning, she arrived at 7:45 a.m. She brought a thermos of tea and 1 hard-boiled egg. She sat with her sign on her lap and a framed photo of Dennis on the ground beside her. He was 19 in the photo, wearing his uniform with a grin too large for the seriousness of the occasion. Margaret sat through sun, through wind, through frost. She brought a blanket when it snowed, a wide straw hat when the sun was cruel. She carried no protest signs, no peace symbols, no anti-war buttons, just one quiet, unanswered question. And slowly, people began to notice. Secretaries, interns, officers, delivery drivers, foreign dignitaries. No one knew her name at first, but everyone knew the chair, the photo, the sign. Where's my son? Some ignored her. Some offered coffee. One soldier, barely older than her son had been, sat with her for 20 minutes and said nothing before rising, saluting quietly, and walking away. Reporters tried to write about her, but she refused interviews. I'm not the story, she said. He is. That became her refrain. When someone asked why she didn't join the rallies, she replied, rallies end. Mothers don't. Over the years, others joined her for a day, a week, a month. One woman brought her own chair. Another simply stood beside her for hours without speaking. But Margaret never coordinated, never organized. She wasn't building a movement. She was holding a space, a space the government wouldn't, by 1972. She was known in Pentagon circles as the chair lady. An internal memo mentioned her presence during a diplomatic visit. It recommended positioning shrubbery to minimize visual impact. The shrubs didn't last. Margaret did, because grief that isn't loud is still powerful. Because asking a question every day is a form of protest, even when no one answers. And still, no word of Dennis, no update, no remains, no letter, just the silence, and a mother who refused to look away from it. But what happens when the government stops listening? When the war ends, but the questions do not? And what does it mean for one woman to become part of the architecture of a place built to forget? Asterisk, by the summer of 1973, Margaret Rollins had become an immovable part of the Pentagon's daily routine. The janitors recognized her dot. So did the bus drivers. Mid-level officers made a habit of walking on the opposite side of the entrance, not out of disrespect, but because they didn't know how to look at her and not feel something they could name. She never asked for money, never asked for airtime. She just asked one question. Where is my son? 5 words, written in the same block letters since the first day. She never replaced the sign, never remarked it. It faded slowly over time, just like Dennis's presence. In official reports, once a week, she cleaned the plastic frame that held his photo. She kept his face sharp, even as her own aged. Wrinkles deepened, hands stiffened, knees betrayed her after long days. But her gaze never weakened, and every evening at exactly 4:30 p.m., she folded her chair, tucked the photo into her bag, and walked slowly but steadily toward the nearest bus stop, back to her apartment, back to the kettle, back to the silence. When asked how long she would keep coming, she always said, until someone answers. But no one did. That year, a young staffer woman, not much older than Dennis, started bringing Margaret a fresh thermos of tea every Monday. At first, Margaret refused it. I'm not a cause, she said. The staffer nodded. It's not for a cause. It's just tea. That small act, repeated every week for 2 years. They never exchanged more than a few words. But when the staffer was transferred, she left a handwritten note on Margaret's chair. Thank you for asking the question. Some of us hear it, even if we can't answer. In 1974, journalists from the Washington Post tried again to feature her. Margaret declined. She allowed one photograph. Her face was invisible, just her hand resting on the frame of Dennis's photo, the sign on her lap catching like morning light. The caption read, "She asks one question. The Pentagon never replies." The article prompted a brief wave of letters. Strangers mailed her notes. Some sent flowers. Few sent money, which she quietly donated to a local shelter. One letter arrived from a boy in Oregon. Age 11, he wrote, I don't understand wars yet, but if I was missing, I'd want my mom to sit for me too. Margaret kept that one folded in her wallet, but what kept her coming back wasn't the press, or the letters, or even the faint possibility that someone would finally tell her where. Her son was Dot. It was ritual. It was discipline. It was the refusal to let time silence a name. By 1975, when the war officially ended and the last U.S. forces left Vietnam, people assumed Margaret would stop. She did not. She arrived the next Monday. As usual, same chair, same sign, same silence, and for the first time, someone from inside the building sat beside her. A man in a dark suit, grained at the temples. He said nothing for 10 minutes. Then he cleared his throat and said, My brother never came back either. She nodded. Nothing more. That was how grief spoke between strangers. Not in explanation, but in presence. Years passed. Margaret grew older. Her walk slowed, but the chair still opened. The photo still stood. Occasionally, tourists asked who she was. The guards never answered. The answer was too long for a brochure. She had become a kind of monument without stone, a woman whose grief had become topography. By 1978, the question had grown heavier, not because it had changed, but because the country had a younger generation passed her by without recognizing the war she spoke of. Some had no connection to it. Others had parents who never spoke of it, but she remained. The faded cardboard was now almost illegible, but no one dared offer her a new sign. It wasn't a statement anymore. It was a document, a relic of unrelenting inquiry. One morning, a staffer approached her gently and asked, "What if the answer never comes?" Margaret said, "Then I'll be the one still asking when it should have come." She never once changed the wording of her question, not even when the official status of her son shifted to presumed dead. Not even when she received, quietly and without ceremony, a letter from the Department of Defense stating, "All reasonable efforts to determine the whereabouts of SGT, Dennis Rollins, have been exhausted." She folded that letter, filed it in a manila envelope. She never stopped showing up because the question wasn't just for her. It had become a question on behalf of all. The mothers who never received letters, who never got bodies, who never knew what corner of the world swallowed their children. Where's my son? But what happens when the country stops hearing a question it cannot answer? And can a folding chair become sacred simply because someone refuses to stand? Asterisk by 1980. Margaret Rollins no longer needed to explain herself. No one asked. The new security staff knew her by sight, if not by name. The schedule rotated, the uniforms changed, but she remained constant. She no longer brought the thermos. Her hands trembled too much to unscrew the lid. But she still arrived, just before 8 a.m., settled her folding chair into its old, familiar groove, and placed the cardboard sign on her lap. The sign, now barely legible, was held together by yellowed tape and sheer habit. "Where is my son?" Some of the letters had faded entirely. Ink had bled. The bottom right corner had worn away, softened by thousands of mornings held in her lap. But no one dared remake it. A woman once offered, a young activist with good intentions, a fresh marker and new cardboard in hand. She said, "I could make you a new one." Margaret looked at her and replied, "This one remembers." That was all, and the activist understood. Because sometimes it's not the words themselves that carry weight, but the way they've aged. That summer, something strange happened. A woman from defense personnel records quietly approached Margaret and offered her a folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, heavily redacted. It listed coordinates, last known radio contact, and a line that read, "Remains not recovered. Area rendered inaccessible due to ordnance." Margaret read it, folded it, said nothing. The staffer asked, "Do you want us to keep searching?" Margaret replied, "He's already here." The woman hesitated. "Where?" Margaret tapped the center of her chest. Here, and she was right. Asterisk, because, in truth, SGT, Dennis Rollins had long since moved from physical fact to something else, memory, as geography. A place that lived inside a mother who refused to move. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened in Washington, D.C. Margaret attended the dedication alone. She waited patiently in line, found panel 32E, ran her fingers across the etched name, Rollins, D.T., 1949 to 1968. She didn't cry. Asterisk, she touched the name once, then left. The next morning, she returned to the Pentagon steps. Same chair, same sign, same silence. Someone asked her why she didn't go sit at the wall. She replied, "The wall is for the fallen. The steps are for the missing." In 1985, Margaret's health declined. She walked with a cane. Her eyesight faded, but she still came. A younger woman from a local church began driving her. They never spoke during the ride. Asterisk. But every afternoon, before folding the chair, Margaret would say, "Thank you for giving me one more day to ask." It became a kind of liturgy. On cold mornings, someone from the security team would bring her a blanket. On rainy days, an umbrella was left propped against her chair. These weren't acts of pity. They were gestures of respect, because no one had lasted like Margaret. Not the protests, not the press, not the speeches, only her. The last time she sat at the Pentagon was November 4th, 1987. She arrived late. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands trembled. But she unfolded the chair with the same care she had every day for nearly 2 decades. She sat, held the sign, closed her eyes. She stayed for 2 hours, then nodded once to the guard at the gate and left. She passed away 2 weeks later, quietly, in her sleep. No formal obituary, just a line in a local paper. Margaret K. Rollins, mother, librarian, veterans, widow, preceded in death by her husband and son. But that wasn't entirely true, because in a hallway of the Pentagon, on a bulletin board, seldom noticed, someone pinned a photo, a snapshot of a woman in a folding chair, cardboard sign on her lap, photo at her feet. It bore no caption. It didn't need one for those who knew. The question was eternal. Where is my son? And though the chair was gone and the sign finally rested, the absence remained. And in that absence, kind of presence, stronger than protest, deeper than silence, a legacy of refusal, of devotion, of a woman who sat not because she was waiting for news, but because the asking itself became an act of memory.